The tragedy of Ukraine. What classical Greek tragedy can teach us about conflict resolution? Nicolai N. Petro. Chapter 1. The domestic tragedy of Ukraine. The tragedy of Ukraine. What classical Greek tragedy can teach us about conflict resolution? By Nicolai N. Petro. Petro opens by reframing Ukraine's war not simply as a geopolitical confrontation between Russia and the West, but as a domestic tragedy rooted in competing internal identities. He argues that the heart of the conflict lies within Ukraine itself, between irreconcilable visions of what it means to be Ukrainian. Drawing from classical Greek tragedy, Petro explores how national trauma, when unacknowledged or manipulated, drives nations towards cycles of internal conflict and collapse. The chapter traces two dominant and rival identities. The first, associated with Galicia and Western Ukraine, identifies Ukraine with Western Europe and views Russia as a colonial oppressor. The second, common in Ukraine's eastern and southern regions, including Donbass, sees Ukrainian and Russian cultures as historically and linguistically intertwined. These identities evolved under different imperial legacies, Austro-Hungarian and Polish on the one hand, Russian and Soviet on the other. Rather than merging after independence in 1991, the gap between them widened. Petro stresses that Ukraine's internal division is not recent. While the 2014 Maidan uprising and Russia's annexation of Crimea intensified the schism, they did not cause it. The real tragedy, he writes, is that Ukraine has never come to terms with its pluralism. Political leaders and institutions, instead of embracing diversity, have often suppressed or delegitimized alternative identities in the name of national unity. Here, Petro introduces the concept of tragedy from the classical Greek tradition. In tragedy, the conflict is not merely external or moral, it is internal and unresolvable through binary thinking. Characters in tragedy are often caught between legitimate yet conflicting values. Petro draws this parallel to Ukraine's predicament. Both Western and Eastern Ukrainian identities are valid, yet the political structure demands the triumph of one over the other. This demand is inherently tragic. Greek tragedy, Petro notes, offered catharsis, a communal emotional release that helps societies confront their shared guilt, shame, or trauma. Ukraine, by contrast, has had no such cathartic reckoning. Instead, its politics remain locked in a cycle of blame and retribution. Those in power define patriotism narrowly, often through exclusion or criminalization of rival narratives. Efforts at reconciliation are interpreted as weakness or betrayal. The result is an emotional stalemate. Institutions cannot resolve this because the conflict is not simply institutional. It is emotional, cultural, and existential. What Ukraine needs, Petro suggests, is a tragic vision of politics, one that abandons moral absolutism and embraces ambiguity, empathy, and compromise. The challenge is to design institutions that do not erase difference, but manage and honor it. This vision demands mutual recognition, not domination. Ukraine's future peace depends on creating a civic space where plural identities can coexist, not be forced into conformity. Without this, the internal war will continue, regardless of changes in external actors or geopolitical alliances. In closing, Petro argues that the classical tragic model offers more than metaphor. It provides a practical guide for conflict resolution in pluralistic societies. The path forward for Ukraine requires less heroism and more humility, a willingness to admit that no single narrative can or should define the nation. Only then can catharsis and lasting peace be achieved. Summary of Chapter 2 of The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution by Nicolai N. Petro. Chapter 2, Two Nations in One State. Petro begins by exploring how Ukraine has never been a culturally or politically unified nation-state in the Western European sense. Instead, it is a country composed of two distinct historical and cultural identities, one rooted in Galicia and Western Ukraine, the other in Malorussia and the East and South. These identities, shaped by separate imperial legacies, languages, religious traditions, and political affiliations, coexist within one geopolitical framework, but rarely with shared national sentiment. The Galician identity, forged under Austro-Hungarian and Polish influence, developed a strong sense of cultural distinction from Russia. It embraced Western Catholic traditions, cultivated a Ukrainian language separate from Russian, and fostered nationalist organizations that sought total independence from Moscow. On the other hand, the eastern and southern Ukrainian identity, Malorossian, grew under the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. Here, cultural hybridity and coexistence with Russian identity were the norm, and many citizens regarded themselves as simultaneously Ukrainian and Russophone. Petro stresses that this division has always been political as much as cultural. In independent Ukraine, elections routinely revealed the East-West split. Western Ukraine voted for pro-European nationalist parties, while the East preferred parties advocating closer ties with Russia. The failure to construct a unifying civic identity after 1991 deepened these cleavages, which manifested in rivalries over language laws, foreign policy alignment, and memory politics. The chapter turns to the interwar period and the rise of Ukrainian nationalism in Galicia, particularly through the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. This group, founded in the 1920s, adopted radical tactics and heroized violent struggle against both Poland and the Soviet Union. Their ideology became central to modern Galician nationalism and was later rehabilitated after 1991 as a foundation for the Ukrainian national myth. Meanwhile, in Soviet Ukraine, efforts at Ukrainization were top-down and fragile, with cultural policies often reversed under Stalin. As a result, Eastern Ukraine never developed a strong grassroots nationalist tradition, reinforcing its distinct orientation from the West. Petro argues that by the early 2000s, Ukraine had crystallized into two nations in one state. The Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Maidan Uprising in 2014 were not just political events, but expressions of this unresolved national dualism. The post-Maidan government's failure to accommodate the Eastern identity by imposing a rigid linguistic and historical framework that celebrated only one regional narrative turned political discontent into existential alienation. He also reflects on the inadequacy of conventional nation-building theories in such a context. Standard democratic models assume a shared sense of belonging, but Ukraine's regions often possess conflicting historical grievances and aspirations. Democracy without a shared national identity, Petro warns, risks degenerating into majoritarianism, where the dominant identity silences or excludes the others. Drawing on Greek tragedy, Petro likens Ukraine's failure to reconcile its dual identities to the tragic flaws of classical heroes. Each side believes in the righteousness of its cause, but this very conviction blinds them to the humanity and legitimacy of the other. True resolution lies not in the triumph of one vision over the other, but in the mutual recognition of difference and the institutionalization of pluralism. The chapter ends with a sobering reflection. Unless Ukraine acknowledges the reality of its internal diversity and builds structures to accommodate it, it will remain trapped in a cycle of political instability and regional alienation. The path out of tragedy begins with empathy, humility, and the courage to accept complexity over simplicity. A clean summary of Chapter 3 of The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution by Nicolai N. Petro. Chapter 3, The Rise of the Extreme. In this chapter, Petro turns his focus to one of the most polarizing and controversial developments in post-Maidan Ukraine, the rise and mainstreaming of ultranationalist and far-right forces. While often downplayed or dismissed in Western commentary, Petro argues that these groups have exerted an outsized influence on Ukraine's political culture, legal frameworks, and national identity narratives since 2014. He begins by distinguishing between patriotism and nationalism, and between liberal civic nationalism and exclusionary ethnic nationalism. While patriotism seeks the good of the entire political community, ethnic nationalism divides society in true Ukrainians and internal enemies. Petro contends that since the Maidan uprising, this exclusionary model has gained dominance. Central to this development is the role of groups like the Right Sector, Azov Battalion, and elements within the Svoboda Party. Though these groups represent a small fraction of the electorate in formal elections, their street power, media presence, and ability to use political violence have made them a force that mainstream politicians must accommodate or appease. Petro traces how these forces transition from the margins into state-supported actors, especially in the security and defense sectors, following the conflict in Donbass. A key argument Petro makes is that the influence of these groups is not merely military or electoral, but symbolic and cultural. They have successfully shifted the center of national discourse by canonizing a narrow vision of Ukrainian identity, one that is militantly anti-Russian, centered on Galician wartime nationalism, and intolerant of linguistic or historical plurality. State holidays, educational reforms, and memory politics now reflect this ideology, often at the expense of inclusiveness and civic cohesion. Petro links this dynamic to the concept of tragic blindness. Just as Greek tragic heroes often fall because they cannot see the consequences of their moral fervor, so too has Ukrainian society overlooked the dangers of tolerating ultranationalist narratives under the justification of patriotism or national defense. In this environment, alternative viewpoints, especially those sympathetic to Eastern Ukraine, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, or historical Soviet contributions, are marginalized or criminalized. The chapter also details the institutionalization of this worldview through legislation. Language laws that eliminate Russian from public life, decommunization policies that criminalize alternative histories, and security doctrines that label dissent as disloyalty all serve to codify one version of Ukrainian identity while excluding millions who do not conform to it. Petro describes this not as democratic consolidation, but as ideological consolidation with tragic consequences. At the heart of the chapter is the warning that embracing extremism, even tacitly or pragmatically, corrodes the moral foundations of the state. Petro highlights how this has undermined Ukraine's ability to offer a civic, inclusive model of citizenship. The war in Donbass is not only a geopolitical crisis, but also a reflection of this failure to imagine a Ukraine big enough for its own people. Petro does not suggest that all Ukrainian nationalism is extremist, nor that the country is defined solely by its far right. Rather, he argues that the failure to clearly repudiate exclusionary ideologies has left the state vulnerable to their logic. This, in turn, fuels the very separatist and reactionary movements it seeks to suppress. He concludes with a call for moral clarity. A tragic vision of politics, informed by classical drama, recognizes the danger of unchecked righteousness. It demands that leaders resist the temptation to define the nation in narrow, militarized, or mythologized terms. Only by returning to the civic ideal, where all citizens are equally entitled to belonging, regardless of language, region, or history, can Ukraine avoid the tragic fate of internal implosion. Here is the full, clean summary of Chapter 4 of The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution, by Nicolai N. Petro. Chapter 4, The Maidan and Its Aftermath. In this chapter, Petro critically examines the 2013-2014 Maidan uprising and its transformative effects on Ukrainian national identity, politics, and civil cohesion. While commonly portrayed in the West as a democratic breakthrough, Petro argues that Maidan marked a rupture rather than a unifying revolution, intensifying the tragic divide between Ukraine's competing regional identities. Petro begins by situating Maidan within the continuum of Ukraine's unresolved identity conflict. He stresses that Maidan was not simply a popular revolt against corruption or a yearning for European integration. It was, more profoundly, the political coming of age of the Galician nationalist vision, which seized control of the national narrative and marginalized alternative identities, particularly those of Russophone Ukrainians and residents of the eastern and southern regions. After Maidan, Petro observes, this nationalist vision rapidly institutionalized itself through government policies, education reform, commemorative practices, and judicial initiatives. These measures aim to entrench a singular, heroic, Western-oriented narrative of Ukraine, often to the exclusion or outright vilification of Soviet or Russian-leaning historical perspectives. As a result, large segments of Ukraine's population, especially in Donbass, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Crimea, came to feel not only unrepresented but politically and culturally alienated from the state. A significant portion of the chapter is devoted to exploring how this exclusionary shift affected political discourse. Thus, language laws eliminated Russian from official and public life, decommunization policies renamed cities and banned historical symbols, and media regulations suppressed dissenting views. While these moves were framed as necessary for national security or post-colonial de-Russification, Petro argues that they effectively delegitimized the lived experience of millions of Ukrainians whose sense of identity was complex, hybrid, or rooted in Soviet-era memories. Petro also addresses the psychological aftermath of Maidan. Instead of achieving a cathartic national reconciliation, Maidan hardened internal divisions. The narrative of heroism and martyrdom created a moral hierarchy in which only those who supported the revolution were regarded as true patriots. Those who did not, or who criticized the revolution's outcomes, were often labeled traitors or agents of foreign influence. This polarizing logic, Petro notes, is the very mechanism that Greek tragedy warns against, the blindness of those convinced of their own moral purity. He introduces the tragic concept of hubris, showing how Maidan's righteous fervor prevented Ukrainian society from reflecting on its internal diversity. Rather than pursuing inclusiveness and dialogue, the post-Maidan government pursued redefinition to make Ukraine singular, unified, and ideologically pure. This redefinition, Petro warns, bore seeds of authoritarianism, not by design, but by a refusal to accommodate difference. The chapter further explores how these dynamics led to the erosion of trust between the state and large segments of its citizenry. In places like Donetsk and Luhansk, where people already felt distant from the political center, these policies confirmed suspicions that post-Maidan Ukraine no longer represented them. The separatist rebellions, Petro argues, were not orchestrated solely from the outside, but emerged from genuine grievances rooted in the exclusionary turn of Ukrainian politics. Petro concludes the chapter by reiterating the need for a tragic political vision, one that recognizes the dangers of purity, the necessity of pluralism, and the futility of building national unity on moral absolutism. Instead of viewing Maidan as the birth of a new Ukraine, he suggests it might more accurately be seen as a moment when Ukraine's internal tragedy was fully revealed. The challenge is no longer resistance to an external oppressor, but the internal reconciliation of a deeply fractured national self. Only through humility, empathy, and institutional pluralism can this tragedy be transformed into a path toward healing. Here is the full, clean summary of Chapter 5 of The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution by Nicolai N. Petro. Chapter 5, The Descent into War. In this chapter, Petro analyzes how Ukraine's unresolved identity conflict, compounded by the events of the Maidan and its aftermath, escalated into full-scale war in the Donbass, and led ultimately to the 2022 Russian invasion. He argues that war was not an inevitable result of geopolitical rivalry, but the tragic outcome of internal misrecognition, an inability or unwillingness by successive Ukrainian governments to acknowledge and integrate their country's internal diversity. Petro begins by situating the outbreak of violence in Donetsk and Luhansk in early 2014 within the broader context of identity-based alienation. After the Maidan Revolution, the new Ukrainian leadership acted quickly to consolidate power and reassert control, but in doing so, it alienated large segments of the population in the east and south. The swift repeal of the 2012 language law, which had allowed regions to adopt Russian as an official language, was seen by many Russophone citizens as a clear signal that their culture and voice were no longer welcome. These perceptions were reinforced by other developments. The glorification of nationalist historical figures hostile to Soviet and Russian traditions, the growing influence of ultranationalist militias, and the marginalization of political parties traditionally supported in the East. Together, Petro argues, these created a sense of existential insecurity. Many in the Donbass came to believe they were no longer part of the national community, and that peaceful accommodation was no longer possible. Petro stresses that the uprising in Donbass began as a political rebellion, not a Russian military operation. The initial calls were not for unification with Russia, but for federalization, local autonomy, and respect for regional language rights. However, the Kyiv government, instead of negotiating, declared an anti-terrorist operation and deployed military force. This decision, Petro argues, closed the door to compromise and escalated the conflict into armed confrontation. Drawing on the Greek tragic tradition, Petro frames this moment as a failure of recognition. Just as Oedipus is doomed by his inability to understand who he truly is and how his actions contribute to his fate, so too was the Ukrainian state blinded by its conviction in the righteousness of its post-Maidan mission. It could not see that the demand for uniformity, linguistic, historical, ideological, would be perceived as aggression by those who had never shared the Galician vision of Ukrainian nationhood. Petro is careful not to exonerate Russia, but he argues that focusing solely on Russian aggression obscures the internal conditions that made such aggression effective. The tragedy, in his view, is that the war might have been avoided had Ukraine developed inclusive institutions capable of managing its internal diversity. The tragedy deepens when one considers how the war has now entrenched exclusion and hatred, making reconciliation ever more difficult. The chapter also explores how the war has reshaped Ukrainian identity. The experience of shared suffering and resistance has, for many, solidified a more cohesive Ukrainian national identity. But this new identity is forged in opposition, not only to Russia, but to what is perceived as Russian culture, language, and history. This dynamic may strengthen short-term unity, Petro notes, but it risks permanently alienating millions of Ukrainian citizens whose cultural roots remain mixed or Russian-influenced. Petro concludes the chapter by returning to the classical Greek insight that tragedy emerges not from villainy, but from the collision of legitimate but incompatible truths. The Eastern Ukrainian desire for recognition and the Western Ukrainian pursuit of cultural sovereignty are both valid. The war arose because no space was created where these conflicting truths could coexist. Instead of building institutions to contain difference, the state pursued moral clarity, and in doing so, plunged into civil war. This chapter stands as a somber reflection on how nations unravel when they pursue identity purity at the expense of pluralism. The descent into war was not an accident of history, but the endpoint of a political logic that could not make room for difference. Only by confronting this truth, painful and humbling though it may be, can Ukraine begin the long road back from tragedy. Here's the complete, clean summary of Chapter 6 of The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict Resolution by Nicolai N. Petro. Chapter 6, Toward a Tragic Vision of Politics. In the final chapter, Petro brings together the threads of historical trauma, cultural division, moral absolutism, and political failure explored in the previous chapters. He offers a philosophical and practical roadmap out of Ukraine's ongoing tragedy, grounded in the classical Greek understanding of tragedy as both a recognition of human limits and a pathway to renewal through catharsis. The question is no longer what caused Ukraine's collapse into internal war and foreign intervention, but what kind of political vision might allow the country to heal. Petro begins by returning to the core insight of Greek tragedy. The downfall of individuals and states often stems not from evil, but from overconfidence in the righteousness of one's cause. This tragic flaw, hubris, blinds leaders and citizens alike to the legitimacy of competing truths. In Ukraine, the post-Maidan political order embraced one identity, one history, and one future as national doctrine, leaving no room for dissenting perspectives. The result was not unity, but division, repression, and war. To move beyond this tragic cycle, Petro calls for the adoption of a tragic vision of politics. This vision does not mean fatalism or passivity. Rather, it means recognizing the permanence of pluralism, the inescapability of difference, and the inevitability of conflicting moral claims in democratic life. Politics, in this vision, is not about eliminating conflict, but managing it with empathy, humility, and institutional wisdom. Petro outlines the basic elements of this tragic vision. First is the need for mutual recognition, acknowledging that those who hold opposing views or cultural loyalties are not enemies, but fellow citizens with equal stakes in the national project. Second is the principle of moral humility, recognizing that even deeply held truths must be tempered by the awareness of one's own fallibility. Third is the role of inclusive institutions, not simply as mechanisms of governance, but as arenas where opposing narratives can be expressed, negotiated, and given a place within the national fabric. Drawing on examples from other deeply divided societies, Petro suggests that federalism, regional autonomy, and language pluralism may offer ways for Ukraine to become a state that contains multitudes, rather than suppresses them. He also emphasizes the importance of symbolic politics, rewriting national memory not to erase painful histories, but to acknowledge them and weave them into a broader civic story. The process of national catharsis, he argues, depends on collective truth-telling, institutionalized empathy, and the deliberate integration of marginalized voices into public life. Petro warns that the failure to adopt such a tragic vision will likely result in the continued militarization of identity, the permanent alienation of regions like Donbass and Crimea, and the erosion of democratic norms in favor of ideological purity. He notes that even as Ukraine fights for its territorial sovereignty, it risks losing its moral sovereignty, the capacity to define itself as a home for all its citizens. The chapter ends with a sober but hopeful reflection. Tragedy in the Greek tradition is not just a narrative of downfall, but a ritual of recognition. Through suffering, individuals and communities can confront painful truths, experience catharsis, and emerge with a deeper understanding of their humanity. For Ukraine, the way out of its national tragedy lies not in military victory or ideological purification, but in the courage to see the other side, not as a threat to be conquered, but as a part of the self that must be embraced. Petro closes by urging policymakers, intellectuals, and citizens alike to abandon the false promise of final solutions. There will be no decisive victory, no singular definition of what it means to be Ukrainian. But there can be a political order that makes space for all the memories, languages, and loyalties that live within Ukraine's borders. In this, he writes, lies the only hope for lasting peace, and for transforming tragedy into shared redemption. Final message, key takeaways. Nicolai Petro's The Tragedy of Ukraine delivers more than a diagnosis of a nation at war. It is a profound meditation on identity, pluralism, and the dangers of moral absolutism in divided societies. Rooted in the timeless logic of Greek tragedy, Petro's central argument is clear. Ukraine's catastrophe was not inevitable, but was set in motion by the systematic refusal to accommodate multiple visions of Ukrainian identity within a single civic framework. At the heart of the tragedy lies the political marginalization of Eastern and Southern Ukrainians, those who speak Russian, honor Soviet wartime sacrifices, or maintain cultural links with Russia. Instead of integrating this population, post-Maidan elites pursued a singular nationalist project, privileging a Galician Western narrative of identity and excluding others as unpatriotic or subversive. That this occurred in the name of democracy and sovereignty only deepens the irony and the tragedy. But Ukraine's tragedy is not unique. What lessons can the world learn? Around the world, many nations face internal fractures along lines of ethnicity, religion, region, or class. Petro's insights offer a stark warning. Where politics seeks to purify rather than pluralize, the state risks not only civil unrest, but disintegration. Unity built on exclusion is inherently unstable. It breeds resentment, provokes backlash, and ultimately corrodes the very institutions it aims to protect. The global lesson is this: democracy without inclusion is fragile. National identity without plurality is brittle, and righteous narratives that dismiss competing truths are more likely to fracture nations than to unify them. A comparison with Malaysia. Malaysia provides a compelling point of contrast and of warning. Much like Western Ukraine's Galicians, the Malay Muslim majority in peninsular Malaysia has, through the ideology of Ketuanan Melayu, Malay supremacy, claimed exclusive moral and political ownership of the nation-state. This ideology marginalizes ethnic minorities, especially Chinese and Indian Malaysians, and defines national belonging in ethno-religious terms, privileging Islam and Malay culture over all others. Just as Galician Ukrainians sought to institutionalize their cultural identity in post-Maidan Ukraine, Ketuanan Melayu policies in Malaysia have entrenched a vision of Malaysia that leaves others on the margins. The banning of minority languages in official contexts, Islamization of public education, and disproportionate access to state resources echo Ukraine's post-2014 push toward a singular national story. In both countries, diversity is tolerated only at the edges, not celebrated as foundational to the nation. Catholics and Malay Muslims, a paradox of dominance. There is a further striking parallel between the Catholic Galicians of Western Ukraine and the Malay Muslims of peninsular Malaysia. In both cases, a religiously and culturally dominant group presents itself as historically aggrieved, using a narrative of victimhood to justify control over national institutions. Galicians, despite gaining control of Ukraine's political narrative, continue to frame their identity as threatened by Russia and Russophones. Similarly, Malay Muslims in Malaysia, who dominate political, legal, and religious institutions, maintain a siege mentality, framing themselves as vulnerable to liberalism, pluralism, or Christianization. This paradox, dominant majorities behaving as oppressed minorities, fuels policy overreach, intolerance, and the erosion of pluralism. It also weakens the democratic project, as laws and narratives are bent not to reflect diversity, but to silence it. The optimistic promise of pluralism. And yet, Petro offers hope. The tragic vision is not one of despair, but of redemption. Tragedy exposes the consequences of hubris so that a wiser, more inclusive future might be imagined. The lesson from Ukraine, and applicable to Malaysia and other divided nations, is that no identity, no history, and no language should be allowed to monopolize the meaning of the nation. Stability lies not in purity, but in plurality. There is still time for Ukraine, and for others, to choose a different path. A path that honors every citizen's narrative, that protects minority rights as foundational, not optional, and that refuses to define national unity in terms of sameness. By institutionalizing empathy and building structures that accommodate diversity, nations can transform tragedy into reconciliation. In the end, the greatest strength of any society is its ability to live with difference, not to erase it. This is the hope Petro leaves us with, that through humility, courage, and mutual recognition, even the most fractured nations can find their way back from the brink. Afterward, victimhood, dominance, and the tragedy of unrecognition, from Ukraine to Palestine. In the final analysis of the tragedy of Ukraine, Nicolai N. Petro presents us with a painful but powerful truth. Nations that insist on a singular moral narrative, that elevate one identity while silencing or marginalizing others, walk a path not to stability, but to prolonged tragedy. This insight, drawn from the deep wells of classical Greek drama, resonates far beyond the borders of Ukraine. It speaks to a broader global pattern where dominant powers, gripped by the righteousness of their founding myths, frame themselves as victims, even as they exert control over others. Nowhere is this dynamic more tragically evident than in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, specifically in Israel's decades-long occupation and subjugation of Palestinian life in Gaza and the West Bank. The architecture of dominance. Since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, and more starkly since the 1967 occupation of the Palestinian territories, Israel has maintained a sophisticated system of control over Palestinian land, movement, resources, and political autonomy. Gaza is subject to a debilitating blockade. The West Bank is fractured by settlements, military checkpoints, and legal dualism. One law for Jewish settlers, another for Palestinians. And yet, despite its overwhelming military, technological, and diplomatic power, Israel continues to present itself as an embattled democracy, surrounded by existential threats. This rhetorical posture mirrors, in some ways, the Ukrainian post-Maidan state's portrayal of itself as a victim of unprovoked aggression, despite having enacted policies that systematically alienated and disenfranchised large segments of its own population. In both cases, the dominant political power refuses to acknowledge the grievances of the marginalized, insisting instead on a unifying national myth that erases internal complexity. In Ukraine, it is the Galician-centric vision of Ukrainian identity. In Israel, it is the Zionist narrative of eternal Jewish victimhood and moral exceptionalism. Victimhood as justification. The tragedy deepens when victimhood is no longer a condition, but a political instrument. Israel, like post-Maidan Ukraine, draws upon a history of genuine suffering to justify its current policies. The Holocaust, for example, is rightly remembered as one of the greatest atrocities in human history. But the memory of that suffering has been weaponized to defend policies that now inflict suffering on others. Military sieges, extrajudicial killings, settlement expansions, and the systemic suppression of Palestinian self-determination are all rationalized through the lens of national survival and self-defense. This mirrors how Ukrainian nationalists invoked the trauma of Soviet repression, the Holodomor, and Russian imperialism to justify eradicating the cultural presence of Russophones and Soviet-era legacies. In both contexts, trauma becomes a shield against criticism. The nation, having once suffered, claims permanent moral high ground. All acts, no matter how coercive, are then cast as defensive. Petro warns us that this is the most dangerous feature of moral absolutism. It blinds societies to their own capacity for injustice. Classical Greek tragedy is replete with heroes whose sense of righteousness leads to acts of cruelty, often against their own families or people. Orestes avenges his father's murder only to become a pariah. Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter in pursuit of glory. In both Ukraine and Israel, national purity narratives have become entangled with a tragic inability to see the other side as fully human. Recognition denied. The Israeli refusal to recognize the Palestinian people as co-equal actors with legitimate claims on land, on dignity, on history, is not dissimilar to Kiev's post-22 refusal to recognize the Donbas or Crimea's identities as authentically Ukrainian. In both cases, identity is used as a gatekeeper for legitimacy. The occupied must prove their loyalty, adopt the dominant language, accept the victor's narrative of history, or be declared traitors, terrorists, or foreign agents. But as Petro shows through Ukraine, coercion cannot produce belonging. No amount of linguistic laws, settlement activity, or military might can force a people to see themselves in a state that denies their dignity. Instead, these efforts harden alienation, radicalize resistance, and entrench a cycle of violence. This is perhaps most vividly illustrated in Gaza. Over 2 million Palestinians, half of whom are children, live under siege conditions with limited access to clean water, medical care, and freedom of movement. Their pleas for recognition, both political and human, are dismissed as propaganda or terrorism. Any resistance, however symbolic, is answered with overwhelming force, framed as a threat to national survival. Like the Donbas rebels who initially demanded federalism but were branded terrorists, Palestinians who call for justice are accused of rejecting peace. Yet in both cases, the dominant power never seriously considered structural inclusion. Instead of negotiation, it offered subjugation. Instead of reconciliation, it demanded capitulation. What comes after tragedy? Petro's work is not simply a cautionary tale. It is an invitation to reimagine politics. A tragic vision, grounded in humility and the acceptance of moral complexity, would require both Ukraine and Israel to acknowledge the humanity of those they have excluded. It would mean dismantling the machinery of domination and recognizing the legitimacy of competing narratives, not to erase one identity, but to make room for more than one. For Israel, this could mean recognizing the Nakba as a foundational trauma for Palestinians, just as the Holocaust is for Jews. It could mean ending the occupation, offering genuine political autonomy, and embracing the idea of a binational civic state, or at the very least, a two-state solution grounded in equality. None of these are easy, but as Petro reminds us, tragedy only becomes transformative when we look directly at the wounds we have inflicted, not just those we have suffered. Hope through pluralism. The path forward lies not in military dominance or rhetorical supremacy, but in a radical act of empathy. Petro's tragic lens teaches us that every party in a conflict carries pain, truth, and longing. Peace emerges not when one side triumphs, but when both sides relinquish the fantasy of moral purity and accept the shared burden of history. Israel, like Ukraine, stands at a crossroads. It can continue to pursue security through exclusion and repression, or it can acknowledge that real security comes from justice. And real justice begins with recognition. Recognition that Palestinians are not an existential threat, but a people. That their suffering is not propaganda, but a wound. That peace is not the silence of the other, but a space in which multiple truths can speak. This is the hopeful promise that the tragedy of Ukraine leaves us with, that even the deepest wounds can be healed when nations have the courage to abandon righteousness and embrace relationship. That pluralism is not a weakness, but a strength, and that in our most divided moments, tragedy itself can be a teacher, leading us not into darkness, but toward the light of understanding, dignity, and shared humanity. Here is the About the Author section for the tragedy of Ukraine. What classical Greek tragedy can teach us about conflict resolution? By Nicolai N. Petro. Nicolai the author. Nicolai N. Petro is an American political scientist and international affairs scholar with decades of experience in Russian and Ukrainian politics, culture, and religion. Born in the United States to a family of Russian émigrés, Petro developed a unique perspective that bridges East and West, making him particularly sensitive to the complexities of post-Soviet identity and conflict. He is professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island, where he has taught since the early 1990s. Petro holds degrees from the University of Virginia and the University of California, Berkeley, and was a Fulbright scholar in both Russia and Ukraine. From 2001 to 2002, he served as a U.S. State Department Special Assistant for Policy on the Soviet Union under President George H.W. Bush. Petro has spent significant time living in Ukraine and maintains scholarly and personal connections throughout the region. He is fluent in Russian and has conducted on-the-ground research in both the western and eastern parts of Ukraine, offering him a rare, first-hand understanding of the country's internal divisions. His body of work spans themes of national identity, Orthodox Christianity, Russian political thought, and conflict mediation. Petro has written extensively for academic journals and policy think tanks, and he is often consulted by international media for his nuanced views on Eastern Europe. In the tragedy of Ukraine, Petro combines his scholarly expertise with a deep humanistic sensibility. Drawing upon classical Greek literature, he reframes the Ukrainian conflict not merely as a product of foreign aggression or failed diplomacy, but as an internal moral and emotional crisis, one that mirrors the structure of Greek tragedy in its descent into violence through the refusal of recognition and reconciliation. Petro's rare ability to synthesize political science, historical analysis, and moral philosophy has made this book a landmark contribution to contemporary political thought. In a world increasingly shaped by polarization and identity politics, his voice is one of caution, wisdom, and hope. He continues to write, speak, and advocate for pluralistic solutions to political conflicts, urging policymakers to see not just what divides nations, but what makes peaceful coexistence possible. A heartfelt light. To every soul whose hand did give, you've helped me dream, helped me live. In darkest hours your light came through, with hearts so kind, so pure, so true. Your gifts, like stars in deepest night, have steered me gently toward the light. Each coin, each word, each silent prayer, a thread of hope so rich, so rare. My eyes once dimmed now seek the skies, and slowly clearer visions rise. Because of you, I dare to see the world again. Its grace, its plea. Your compassion's flame will not just stay with me alone. It lights the way for others wandering through despair to feel the warmth of selfless care. You've shown what love in action means, in quiet ways through giving scenes. You've built a bridge from soul to soul and made the broken feel more whole. So let this thanks rise like a song, a melody both soft and strong. May your example gently call more hearts to rise to give. To fall into the joy of lifting pain, of planting hope where none remains. Your kindness walks beside me still, a light, a love, a living will.
forget to hit that subscribe button to show your support.